Well, thanks, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks to the organising group for allowing me to come all the way from Western Australia to have a yarn and come to the Hunter Valley. I'm looking forward to tasting a famous Semillon in the next 2 days. Okay, I'll just talk a bit about MSA and some of the more recent developments and follow on from Sarah. So I'll talk first of all about dark cutting, the major cause of non-compliance. So it's a fixed pH number, and if you're above that, you're excluded from MSA. Of course, the other key thing you need to be is a registered MSA producer. And of course, there'll be no one in this room who's not registered, correct? Right, well that's good, because if you're not registered, you might as well piss off now and go out in the middle of the oval. No, it's not true. Just see Sarah and the team straight afterwards. I'd love to have you. So I know you have to be a registered producer to supply MSA, and it's not hard to become one. We'll talk about nutrition, a bit about minerals, mycotoxins and water. So a little of this work was done on King Island, and I'm going to ask you to help me whether it's relevant to you or not. But it was a large experiment funded by Meat and Livestock Australia and MSA. Then I'll just progress a little bit further around the MSA Index, following on from Sarah. So what is dark cutting? Hopefully most of you know dark cutting, the beef is darker in colour versus, so that's on my right, your right-hand side is a dark colour. And we are, of course, in the future hoping that you'll be able to actually receive pictorial feedback, should you choose to, via websites with your collaborating processor, with the cameras that will become available. So this dark cutting meat has a high pH. The pH is greater than 5.7. So we want acidic meat actually is good meat, if you like. So what, and the meat colour, which is more of a company specification, but many supermarkets still require colour as a key metric, needs to be less than 3, not greater than 3. Sorry, if it's greater than 3, it's too dark. Now, the main cause of dark cutting is this high pH meat, but it's actually a very simple cause primarily, and it's muscle sugar. So the amount of muscle sugar at slaughter in your muscles is a determinant of the final acidity the meat reaches. And it's because after death, the glycogen or sugar is converted to lactic acid, a little bit like when you run around playing soccer or footy, or you play this funny game rugby over here, I think, which I'm sort of even too scared to watch. It looks so brutal. So we need that lactic acid, and you need muscle glycogen or muscle sugar to fuel that. Now, muscle glycogen is a simple product of nutrition on the farm. That's the nutritional source of the carbon to fill the glycogen bucket up. And then, of course, how much stress, exercise the animal is under that causes muscle glycogen to be burnt, a bit like in a rugby game. Now, the great thing about muscle glycogen is the bucket of muscle glycogen, if it's full, is roughly 2%. So your muscles, our muscles, cattle muscles, sheep muscles in a well-fed animal that's not been flogged around the paddock by a dog should be about 2%. You only need the bucket to be half full at slaughter, so 1%. So you've got some hope, in other words. If you needed the bucket to be full at slaughter, it'd be pretty tough, but you only need it half full. So the point being is the better nutrition gives you more insurance to stop that dark cutting. That's the reason why we focus on nutrition. Of course, we also focus on transport stress, mixing stress, handling stress, etc. Now, these are rough numbers, Sarah. I might have them a little bit wrong, but again, you can get them out of the little booklets that are here on the website. MSA does have a wonderful support with its website and paperwork. Roughly speaking, the national average for dark cutters is about 5% over all cattle. Grain-fed cattle, guess what they are? They're 2%. So that straight away, you sort of suspect that nutrition's got a fair bit to do with that. I also agree, of course, these cattle are more confined and not running around so much. There's a bit of both, but almost clearly nutrition. The great thing about grain-fed cattle, we did a big transport study using the retrospective MSA database, which is a wonderful resource. The fact that all the MSA data is on a big computer or whatever size computer it is in Brisbane. And grain-fed cattle do not respond to transport distance with increases of dark cutting, whereas grass-fed cattle do. And that's, to me, tells me almost purely it's because of the nutritional setup of those animals. And grass-fed is not particularly published all over the place. It probably hovers around about 10% as a national average, very roughly. And I'll come back to a figure that I think you should target at the end, and I think Mark will confirm that it's quite doable to target this figure. All right, so glycogen turns over in the real world. So I'll give you a bit of a biochemistry lesson. I'm actually a biochemist. I'm not one of those fancy economists who makes a lot of money with other people. I'm just a bog biochemist who likes to get into chest tubes and measure things. So glycogen turns over, just like your body tissues turn over. So turnover means it's being synthesized and broken down all the time naturally. This is a natural biochemical phenomena. Wouldn't surprise you. And the thing about turnover is small opposite influences on either side have a large input into the final direction. So a small reduction in nutrition, I don't know how nutrition works here. I mean, normally it's milk and honey here, I know that, but I know you've done it tough. But over my way, it might be the spring-summer transition. The feed just hays off, bang, gone. Or it might be the tough, cold winter times down south. You don't get cold winters here, do you? I mean, bloody beautiful here all the time. You walk around bikinis most of the time, I reckon. But anyway, so a bit of nutritional pressure, and then you've got a bit of unseasonal hot, unseasonal cold. They've still got to walk around in grades. They've got to graze more and more, walk more and more. So a little bit of upward pressure on glycogen degradation. The final result is bigger than one or the other. You see what I'm saying? So a chronic, slow change in both of those can give you a big effect. Because in fact, you can fast an animal for 40 days. This was not done by me. It's highly illegal to do that now. This was done back in the 50s. And they measured pH of animals that were put in a pen, in a place, in an animal house where they were very familiar, fasted them for 40 days, gave them water, of course, otherwise they would have been dead. No dark cutters. There was no turnover of glycogen. There was no stress on them. So it's this turnover that's important. Righto, so how much nutrition do you need? Well, unfortunately, you need a fair bit. Ideally, to get grass-fed cattle to be as good as grain-fed cattle with compliance, you'd need about 0.81 kilo per day live weight gain. That's a fair bit on grass. You can do it, don't get me wrong. Plenty of grass situations where you can, but that's a fairly hard ask. It means pretty high quality pasture. You're talking about around about 10.5 megajoules, which is quite a lot of energy. It needs to be a growing, young pasture, and a bit of bite length. Of course, the cattle are going to be able to bite it. So, not surprisingly, those who are more agronomically blessed than myself, that wasn't my best subject, agronomy. I was more into chasing orchids and ladies than I was looking at subclover and perennial ryegrass. I was bad at the whole lot of it, by the way, just in case you're wondering. But you need early vegetative grass clovers, of course, to get that high ME. Once things start to hay off, you're well familiar with this, the energy levels drop and your dark cutting rates will go up. So you need some sort of supplementation. Now, supplementation is, of course, horses for courses, and of course it's expensive this time of year, and I'll just give you a bit of a feel for some of the supplementation work we've done. And Mark would be well versed also in supplementation to meet grass-fed specifications, because you can supplement and meet grass-fed specifications as well. But I won't talk about that today. So in WA we have a rapid hay off. It's happening right now. So our dark cutting spike, as Sarah knows, goes up every single year as we have a hay off. Everybody wants to sell their cattle all at once, and of course they can't. So we run into a bit of a problem. So we looked at supplementation. Now these numbers will relate to, they'll be much more expensive here under your prices at the moment because of grain prices have gone through the roof with the dreadful time you've had. But we had basically controlled cattle and cattle treated with, fed a grain-fed pellet for 2 weeks, or straight lupins. So lupins are a high protein a pulse. So that was a particular cost at the time. We were talking about a serious number of cattle, nearly 1,000 head there and about 500 head in South Australia, so two states. And then we look at the results. So the results are a bit disappointing because, of course, as soon as you do research on cattle, all the dark cutting rates really drop. So our base rates of dark cutting, 3%, 4%, really low. So people were obviously handling the cattle perfectly. Everybody was absolutely smicko. So what we did was we actually measured muscle glycogen. And it's a small shift, but a very highly statistically significant shift. Every time we fed the cattle, muscle glycogen in the grey bar was, except for that one, was higher. Every time was higher. So statistically, that was a very strong result. And when you're down at 1%, going from there to there, that particular one, that line of cattle was saved, if you like, by that supplementation. So it's a good insurance. Now, what the point being is that in this particular work, the main thing I wanted to do with Pete McGilchrist and other collaborators was to work out how much carcass gain you could get in 2 weeks. You can work it out theoretically, but of course these cattle had to adapt to this new diet and whatever else. So what we got was about 3 kilos of carcass gain. So it allows you to do the sums, no matter what the feed cost is or the slaughter cost is. I mean, anybody can do that. You just work it out, is it going to be viable for me to feed these cattle to target a better compliance of MSA? So yeah, about 3 kilos of carcass weight gain was returned. And Mark would have similar numbers for various grass-fed compliant pellets, I'm sure, if you wanted to speak to Mark and their supply chain. So the bottom line is an extra 30 megajoules per day basically worked. And the thing is, this is all about preparing your market, cattle for market. In some years, you might have a fair bit of grass, and what we're going to do, you're going to save one decent paddock as your consignment paddock. That's another way to do it. It doesn't have to be supplementation. Might be some flats somewhere that have got a bit more clover or whatever. I mean, talk to your agronomist. I've got no freaking idea about grass, other than get it right and it'll pay dividends. Righto. Now, another one we looked at, and this was down at in King Island. Now, King Island is perennial pasture country. I think it's probably normally perennial pasture country here. Is that correct? It looks a bit perennial sort of when I was coming out. I'm hopeless again, but it looks to me like normally you'd expect perennials, particularly in this Hunter area, to be going. So, so I think it's somewhat relevant to you, albeit a lot further south. So what we found is in King Island, the pasture level, the level of magnesium in the pasture itself was related to the incidence of dark cutting. So it's a bit noisy, but it's a highly significant decline. So the higher the pasture magnesium on analysis, the lower, on average, the rates of dark cutting. A similar experiment was cattle were followed through in South Australia. We got the same result in South Australia, again in the southeast of South Australia, where it's more perennial focus, not up north where it's be more annual, like where I come from. So it's clearly magnesium does seem to protect cattle somewhat from dark cutting. Now the theory behind it is that low magnesium can affect voluntary food intake, but I suspect a more important aspect of magnesium is that it's well known to be involved in muscular and nervous function. And it settles animals down basically. So many of the horse calming potions that my horsey tart wife buys, sorry, she's a lovely lady, but I just always call horsey ladies horsey tarts. Again, probably one of the few reasons why I rode horses when I was younger. So I'm not politically very correct, so you can take me out the back and get me sort of, it's too late to change me, I'm afraid. But if you've got low magnesium, it's well understood you get hyperexcitability and convulsions. And in fact, in our local trendy markets in Freo, that's where I come from, I'm a beautiful boy these days, they sell friggin', there's stands where they sell friggin' magnesium. I've got friends who take magnesium for muscle cramps and all sorts of shit. I don't know whether it works or not, but there's a lot of evidence behind magnesium being somewhat of a calming influence. So that's that was another bit of interesting research that's pretty recent, that's come out of that King Island work. Now, the last bit of work that came out, the team measured all sorts of friggin' things. Dam water, this all sorts of stuff. Well, for some reason, dam water came out to be highly, significantly important for dark cutters. Actually, the most important thing was dam versus trough. And from far as we could work out, the water source was somewhat similar. It wasn't like radically different water. It wasn't scheme water. There's no friggin' scheme water in King Island. So the water was essentially the same, but somehow different. Now, the only thing we can think of is the cleanliness, hygiene aspect of trough water versus dam water. So I don't know what the reason is. I'm just telling you, the data just told us. And it was as clear as, like, it was really strong effect. So it's just a lot of nutritionists will tell you, never forget water, and I always do. And it's just a bit of a reminder that never forget water, so which I always do. Now one other came up. This came up because for all sorts of reasons, King Island people are beautiful people and everything else, but their cattle are friggin' mad. They are mad as hell. I'm getting too old. I wasn't game enough to get in the yards of the bastards. But you had to be able to climb up those fucking cattle rails pretty bloody quick, because one of them's going to get you. I said, Pete, why are they so friggin' mad? And he said, I think they're on drugs, Dave. I said, oh, give us a break, mate. They're down pretty straight area of the bloody world down there, you know, good farmers and, you know, a few beers, of course, but that's about all I saw down there. I didn't see anybody reefers being passed around. I'm a 70s boy as well, so, you know, you've got to watch that. Now, so mycotoxins are fungi that particularly persist in perennial pastures down in that deep thatched area, you know, the thatchy area of your pastures. I'm sure, again, an agronomist will know better than me. And one of the classic one is ryegrass staggers, I suppose, which you've probably heard of that one. Phalaris staggers, a little bit related as well. But these are mycotoxins that are having a bit of a subclinical effect. There's a whole list of them. The chemistry of mycotoxins is incredibly complicated, but you know, LSD is sort of like a mycotoxin, and I'm not joking in that sense. So anyway, we measured a couple of different mycotoxins, and I can't even pronounce their names. They're a very expensive assay. We had to get them done in Singapore. And anyway, the level of mycotoxins on more than one of them did relate to this dark cutting. So these are sort of like almost psychoactive compounds in the base of the plant coming from the fungi. And they're actually there in synergy with the plant to protect the plant from overgrazing. So it's like a co-evolution thing. Now, the only way I know to get rid of the friggin' things is to change the sward. Modern swards, like modern perennial ryegrass, modern whatever friggin' grasses you grow here, I don't know. Again, I'm not very good at agronomy. But the modern swards are mycotoxins, have lower levels of mycotoxins and less harmful ones. So it's just another statistical thing that came up. So there's a whole lot of new areas that have come up in this compliance story that I thought you might be interested in. I feel sure in normal seasons will have some relevance to you here. Now, a little bit on the MSA Index. Sarah alluded to it, and it's been a very useful and simple tool, I believe, that's just polished the MSA off beautifully for feedback to you people, for feedback within a processing company itself. I'm sure Mark will testify to this. And even for Mark and JBS to talk to their customers about how good their beef is with evidence. So it has benefits right through the value chain. Really, far more than I ever envisaged when we first discussed it at our Pathways meeting. So it's basically a weighted average of the eating quality across all the edible cuts, or sorry, the major muscles in the animal, all eaten to their most normal cooking method. All aged at the same time, so all the non-farm factors are fixed. And so the index is really only the farm factors, if you like. So that's what the index is. So it's just one nice simple number. The key things that influence, we talked about pH, that doesn't affect the index because that's just in or out. Rib fat does a little bit, but that's more in and out. If you're less than 3 mils, you're out. You've got to have enough fat on the animal. Rib fat doesn't have a huge effect beyond that. Of course, Bos indicus content does, but I won't dwell on Bos indicus. I don't think I'm in Bos indicus country so much, but I'm happy to talk about that offline. I'm sure Sarah and her colleagues are as well. HGPs certainly are. Marble score is certainly important, and ossification or physiological age are the key things that I'll talk about further that are going to determine the MSA index of your cattle. So there are other things, of course, milk-fed vealers. So if you turn cattle off, young calves off at about 10 months old, that's sort of the milk-fed vealer category, but I don't think that's so common anymore, so I won't dwell on that. Sale yards, of course, if you supply through sale yards, you're a friggin' idiot, and that just wrecks the cattle straight up. Carcass weight does a little bit, but it's more in reference to the other parameters, and sex has a small effect. So the three things I'll talk about in more detail are are marble score and ossification, and I'll actually mainly focus on marble score and a little bit on HGPs. And a little bit on HGPs will be just right now, is that HGPs are one of the biggest impacts on reducing the MSA index. So hormonal growth promotants, steroidal hormonal growth promotants make beef tougher. It's not a problem, like you can still use them, they're not MSA, you're still MSA eligible. It's not, I don't care less whether you use them or not, but I'm just telling you, if you're targeting at a certain MSA index, the HGPs will reduce that index. They make beef tougher. It's unequivocal. Okay, that's all I'll say about HGPs. It's just a choice, and it's really a negotiation or understanding with your processor and market. And I'm sure that's as simple as that. So ossification, I'll come back to that, and marble score. Now, with a little bit with respect to the index, so Sarah has clarified this for me. I've just given you some, I like a competition. So just give you some average values for WA. We're 60.25, South Australia 60.54, Victoria 59.35 of the 3 cattle that are registered for MSA Victoria. And New South Wales, you're 57.57. But Sarah pointed out you're something like 59.5, I think, for your index. So you're right up there with our southern sisters and brothers, which is good, so that the Hunter region. Now, and as Sarah pointed out, the higher the index, the more cuts are eligible for higher MSA grade. That's the basis of it. And that's why people like Mark are using it to sort their brand structures around MSA grades. Now, the thing is, I think Mark uses, if I'm allowed to say it, Mark, a threshold of 61 or thereabouts for entry into the Great Southern Program, which is their grass-fed program. So 61 will be something like about the top 40% of cattle in these southern areas and the Hunter Valley, something like that. 35 to 40% of the top cattle are eligible to go into. Top 25% ends up being something like that. So you can see already that brand structure is segmented to the top end. Righto. Now let's just go into that index a little further. So first of all, we have an emphasis on whole-of-life nutrition. That'll affect marble score and ossification. So ossification, to put it simplistically, the younger you kill them, the lower the oss. There's other factors are in there, heifers are higher, you know, HGPs, da-da-da-da-da, but the younger you kill them, the lower the oss. And in a perfect world, you'd knock them off at about 18 months, in a perfect world. I mean, it doesn't always work that way. You can go older, it doesn't matter, but in a perfect world, about 18 months, will give you a respectably low oss. The other way to do it is through, of course, combine it with genetics. So 400-day weight is a breeding value for 400-day weight. So the higher the 400-weight breeding value, the faster the potential for growth. Of course, you've got to feed them, but the faster the genetic potential. So you don't need to use hormones. You just bang a bit more 400-day growth into them. You get the same effect. And then, of course, intramuscular fat will respond strongly to genetics as well. I'll come back to that in a minute. I better hurry up. And then, of course, you utilise carcass feedback. And the carcass feedback's second to none. Sarah's been through it. There's computer programs coming out your ass. You can look at it every different way. Cut it and slice it any damn way you want, and you can have a look at it. And they're really easy to use, so that's good. And there's even you can even Google the calculator. You can calculate your own friggin' index from your own numbers. So it's not hard. It's all there. Google it. Get the kids to blink and Google if you can't. Make sure you turn all the sites for sex and HGPs off. You never know what might come up. Right, I now want to finish on intramuscular fat, just because it's a little bit of a mystery sometimes to people. You know, you've got to be Japanese. You've got to feed cattle beer. You've got to massage them every night. You've got to sit on your ass and stand on your heads, close your eyes, and they might marble. Well, actually, it's much simpler than that. Intramuscular fat is just one of many fat depots: subcutaneous, intermuscular, channel and kidney fat, abdominal fat, and there's intramuscular. So it's just one fat depot. It's actually fat cells between muscle fibres, inside the muscle almost, yeah? So that's what intramuscular fat is. Here's the growth curve of intramuscular fat in 3 different experiments. The black line is an old US paper, the red line's a beef CRC serial slaughter, and the top line is a friend of mine from Japan where we had Japanese black by Holstein cattle. So let's say we choose 300 kilos. Well, you can see here the Angus cattle are about halfway through their development. They could go further, but if they get really heavy in fat. And the Japanese cattle, of course, are about twice as marbled. The thing about marbling is they were twice as marbled, we guess, at the start, and they're twice as marbled, we know, at the end. It looks like a big difference at the end. This is 25% fat, this is 10% fat. So the marble score will be through the roof in differentials, but nothing's changed. Twofold. So it seems how these cattle were set up was really important. And the major factor so far we can understand in setting those cattle up is the genetic setup, not some magical feeding regime or whatever. So let's look at sheep and pigs, lambs and pigs. There's a serial slaughter of some lambs we did some years ago. They were pretty elite, fairly muscular lambs, I must confess, before we were particularly interested in intramuscular fat. And there's some pigs we serial slaughtered. They're actually female pigs. So at least lamb goes up a little bit as you make them heavier. Not as dramatic as beef. And pigs don't even go up at all when you serial. You make pigs heavier and fatter, they don't deposit anything in their muscles. They're still shit meat, you know. It might be half the price of beef, but so it should be. It should be less than that. You bastards who buy it, I don't know how you do it. Chicken as well, I mean, far out. Talk about empty protein, you know, empty protein. It makes me shiver every time I eat it. So what's going on for pigs and cattle and all the rest of it, pigs and sheep? Well, this is a bit of a stretch. I've put all these animals on the same graph with the percent carcass fat as the common denominator. So it's a bit rough. They're all different experiments, but it's the best. That's what, you know, scientifically we can get away with anything. And you can see they're sort of roughly on the same graph, and it's only these cattle here that were getting really fat that were starting to put on those high levels of IMF. Let's come back to, and there's the Japanese black cross cattle. See that? The genetic propensity to marble makes a huge difference in them. So let's look at it in theory. I think what happens is the more muscular, the heavy muscular animals, or the very large animals that take a shitload of time to finish, you're pushing the curve to the right all the time. You're pushing it to the right, pushing it to the right. And, you know, pigs get killed here. They never, ever reach a stage of maturity where they start to marble. They've got so much muscle in them. Now, it's great for efficiency, but shit outs for the consumer. Unless you want to do pulled pork. Well, it's pulled pork. I mean, far out. Pulling pork. Pulling cattle's bad enough, but pulling pork, gosh, pulled pork. That's what people eat, by the way, in Sydney and stuff, you know, sort of shit, I can't stand it. Anyway, what I'm really reinforcing is that marbling is actually a ratio of two things. A lot of people forget this. It's the weight of fat in the muscle divided by the weight of fat plus the weight of muscle. It's a ratio. So marbling is actually fat and muscle, one divided by the other. You got me? So there's too much friggin' muscle. No matter what you do with intramuscular fat, the muscle's just going to dilute it out. So it's about managing that extreme nature of the cattle you're on about. Now, in terms of some metrics, if you're a grain feeder, you'll get about 17 marble points per 10 kilos of carcass weight gain in your average British breed cattle. This is old beef CRC data. So averaged across Shorthorns, Herefords, Angus, all the rest of it. You get a higher return if they're genetically more gifted for marbling. You got me? But it just gives you round figures. For a grass-fed finish, on average, you get about 10 MSA marble score points for every 10 kilos of carcass weight. That is sort of averages. For some reason in lamb, if you do it per kilo of carcass weight, you only get 0.04% of IMF units, about 10-fold less than beef. So beef, you get about 0.2 per 10 kilos. I always reckon 1 kilo of lamb's about the same as 10 kilos of beef. You got me? You know, 10 to 1, the sort of weight, whatever. So I think lamb, the reason why it doesn't respond to weight and fat so much for marbling is it's still young. Muscle's still growing in lamb. You see, that's that muscle divided by, fat divided by muscle story. Righto. What I'm really saying is I don't think grain finishing is particularly special for marbling. I think the amount of energy you throw down the animal's throat is. So bloody good grass, you could be this one here at A, so kill them at 300 kilos, it'll have higher marbling. Poor grass, you'll be on B. You understand what I'm saying? So I don't think it's necessarily grain, but of course grain is the simplistic way to get good nutrition. Of course, we all know that. All right, so that's about it for me. A couple of minutes over time. Sorry, Mr. and Mrs. Chairman. Aim for 5% dark cutters if you're grass-fed. Now, I think Mark said a lot of his supply chains can either equal or smash that. He'll tell him. He'll tell you in a minute. He's not allowed to tell you now. Nutrition, energy and minerals. So minerals have popped up in our data. Mycotoxins, old-fashioned pastures, just be wary of those. You know, things like, obviously, you understand, if you've seen ryegrass staggers, the bloody things shiver and carry on like buggery. Of course they'll be mobilising glycogen. Water, that's just a classic one that came up for us, water. You know, who would have thought it'll be that important? Of course, stress minimisation. And then finally, this MSA Index is a wonderful tool for communication right through the supply chain. And in the case of JBS, I'll give them a plug. They've been one of the first to use it. And it's quite transparent. If you're 61 or more, you're in this top-level program. And then it goes from there. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for your time, and lovely to be in the Hunter Valley. Cheers.